The smell of burning thatch mixed with the salt air from the North Sea. Sister Hilda pressed herself against the cold stone wall, hands clenched so tightly in prayer her knuckles turned white. Outside, the screams weren't the sounds of battle, they were something far worse. These were the cries of women who had devoted their lives to God, now facing horrors the church would never dare record. Through a narrow window, Hilda saw the monastery courtyard in chaos. Smoke billowed from the chapel, its golden cross ripped down and the roof set ablaze by Viking raiders. The bodies of monks lay scattered, blood seeping between the stones as if the earth itself was drinking the sacrifice. But it wasn't the dead that paralyzed Hilda with terror. It was what was happening to the living. Nuns, her sisters, were being dragged toward the longships, their habits torn, their dignity shattered. Sister Fleda, who had taught Hilda to read Latin, was being pulled by her hair, her vows and years of devotion offering no protection. The youngest, barely 16, screamed in a voice that was no longer human, just raw, animal fear. Even the abbess, a woman respected by bishops and scholars, was forced to watch, her veil torn away, her face streaked with blood. Hilda realized she was witnessing something that would never be fully written down. The official records would mention a raid, a destroyed church, stolen treasures. But the fate of the nuns, their suffering, their names, would be erased, hidden behind phrases like unspeakable acts and great suffering. The silence in the chronicles was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of forgetting, a refusal to acknowledge the true horror unleashed that night. And what happened next would haunt not just the survivors, but the entire history of the church. What Sister Hilda saw that night would echo through history, but not in the way you might expect. The monks who survived, or those who later heard the stories, would write about the Viking raid in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. They would record that heathen men had come from the sea, that the church was destroyed, monks were killed, and treasures stolen. They would call it the beginning of the Viking Age, the first great terror from the north. But when it came to the women, the nuns who suffered most, the scribes fell silent. The chronicles spoke in riddles and euphemisms. The sisters suffered greatly. Unspeakable acts were committed against the brides of Christ. The details were left out, not because they were unknown, but because they were too disturbing to write. The church could not bear to record the desecration of consecrated virgins. To write down what happened would be to admit that even the most sacred, the most protected, could be violated. It would mean acknowledging that spiritual authority offered no shield against physical violence. So the scribes chose silence. They hid the truth behind phrases that concealed more than they revealed. Later historians, reading these records, often assumed nothing especially terrible had happened, just the usual casualties of medieval warfare. But the Vikings themselves remembered. In their sagas, passed down for generations, they spoke of Christian holy women as special prizes, valued not just for their beauty, but for their sacred status. To possess a nun was to claim victory not only over her, but over the Christian God who was supposed to protect her. A few rare documents, hidden in distant monasteries, tell a different story. Letters between abbots debated what to do with nuns who survived captivity, now considered defiled and unfit for religious life. Penitential texts struggled to assign penance for women who had suffered violations against their will, women who now lived in a kind of spiritual limbo. The silent. But the truth, as always, found ways to survive. In the shadows of monastery archives, in the margins of letters and penitential texts, fragments of these women's stories endured. Some Irish monasteries, spared from the worst of the Viking onslaught, quietly preserved accounts that others tried to erase. There, scribes copied and recopied letters between abbots, debating the fate of nuns who had survived captivity. These women, once considered the purest of the pure, now found themselves in a cruel limbo. The Church, so quick to preach forgiveness, struggled to accept them back. Canon law had no clear answer for women who had been violated against their will. Were they still brides of Christ, or had their suffering made them unfit for the life they had chosen? The dilemma was profound. Some abbots argued for compassion, insisting that these women were victims, not sinners. Others, bound by tradition and fear of scandal, refused to let them return. The penitential texts from this era are heartbreaking in their confusion. They offer penances for women who have suffered at the hands of pagans, but the language is vague, the punishments inconsistent. Some nuns were sent to remote hermitages, forced to live out their days in isolation. Others were quietly married off, their vows dissolved by necessity. A few, remarkably, found ways to reclaim their dignity, becoming leaders in new communities or chroniclers of their own stories. Yet for most, the silence was suffocating. Their names vanished from the records, their fates left unspoken. The Church's refusal to acknowledge their suffering was a second violation, compounding the trauma of the first. And all the while, the Viking sagas boasted of their conquests, celebrating the capture of holy women as proof of their power over the Christian world. The contrast could not be starker. Where the Church saw shame, the Vikings saw triumph. Where the scribes wrote silence, the raiders sang songs of victory. But even in the when the Viking longships finally landed on the shores of Lindisfarne, the illusion of sanctuary was shattered in a single morning. The nuns, who had spent their lives believing in the protection of their vows and the strength of their stone walls, suddenly found themselves face to face with a force that recognized either. The raiders came not just for gold and relics, but for the living symbols of Christian faith, women who, in the eyes of the Church, were untouchable. The violence that followed was not random. It was calculated, a deliberate attack on everything the monastery represented. The Vikings knew the value of their captives. In their own sagas, they boasted of taking holy women, describing them as prizes whose capture proved their dominance over the Christian God. For the nuns, the horror was twofold. Not only were they subjected to violence and humiliation, but they also understood that their suffering would be erased by the very institution that had promised to protect them. The Church, unable to reconcile the reality of violated sanctity with its own teachings, chose silence. The chronicles would record the destruction of buildings and the loss of treasures, but the fate of the women would be hidden behind phrases like, "The sisters suffered greatly." For the survivors, the aftermath was a new kind of exile. Some were ransomed back to their families, but many were left in a spiritual limbo, no longer considered pure enough to remain in religious life. The Church's laws, designed to protect, now became barriers to healing. Letters between abbots reveal the agony of decision: should these women be allowed to return, or were they forever marked by what had been done to them? Some were sent to remote hermitages, others quietly married off, their vows dissolved by necessity. A few, remarkably, found ways to rebuild, becoming leaders in new communities or chroniclers of their own stories, but most simply disappeared from the records. The Viking raids did mo. The trauma of the Viking raids didn't end when the flames died down, or the longships vanished over the horizon. For the nuns who survived, the aftermath was a new kind of ordeal, one that unfolded in silence, behind monastery walls and in the margins of history. Some were ransomed back to their families, but many found themselves in a strange limbo, neither fully accepted by the Church nor welcomed back into secular society. The very vows that had once set them apart as holy now marked them as defiled, in the eyes of canon law, even though their suffering had been forced upon them. Letters between abbots and bishops reveal the agony of these decisions. Some Church leaders argued for compassion, recognizing that these women were victims, not sinners. Others, bound by tradition and fear of scandal, insisted that the nuns could never return to their former lives. The penitential texts from this era are filled with uncertainty, offering penances for women who have suffered at the hands of pagans, but never quite knowing how to restore their dignity or their place in the community. Some nuns were sent to remote hermitages, forced to live out their days in isolation. Others were quietly married off, their vows dissolved by necessity. A few, remarkably, found ways to reclaim their dignity, becoming leaders in new communities or even chroniclers of their own stories. But for most, the silence was suffocating. Their names vanished from the records, their fates left unspoken. The Church's refusal to acknowledge their suffering was a second violation, compounding the trauma of the first. Meanwhile, the Viking sagas boasted of their conquests, celebrating the capture of holy women as proof of their power over the Christian world. The contrast could not be starker. Where the Church saw shame, the Vikings saw triumph. Where the scribes wrote silence, the raiders sang songs of victory. Yet even in the face of this erasure, some stories survived. In rare letters in the margin. The shockwaves from the Viking raids forced the Church to confront its own failures. The promise of sanctuary had been broken, and the silence that followed was not just about shame, it was about the limits of spiritual authority in a world ruled by violence. As news of the attacks spread, monasteries across Britain and the continent began to change. Walls were rebuilt higher and thicker. Watchtowers and fortified gates became common, and some communities even hired mercenaries for protection. The architecture of faith was now shaped by fear. But the changes went deeper than stone and mortar. The Church was forced to reconsider its teachings about purity, sin, and forgiveness. The old laws had been written in a world where the violation of a nun was unthinkable, but now, the unthinkable had become reality. Some church leaders began to argue that women who had suffered at the hands of raiders should not be blamed or cast out. Quietly, new forms of penance and reconciliation were developed, allowing some survivors to return to religious life. In rare cases, nuns who had endured captivity became symbols of resilience, their stories whispered as examples of faith under fire. Yet, for many, the wounds never healed. The trauma lingered in the silence of the cloisters, in the empty cells of those who never returned, and in the careful euphemisms of the chronicles. The Church's struggle to respond to the suffering of its women revealed deep tensions between doctrine and compassion, between the ideal of sanctity and the reality of human vulnerability. The legacy of these events would shape not only the future of monastic life, but also the broader history of women in the Church. As the Viking Age continued, the memory of Lindisfarne and other devastated monasteries became a warning and a lesson. The Church could no longer afford to ignore the dangers faced by its most vulnerable members. In the centuries that followed, new rules and protections were put in place, and the